This is not a women's issue. It's not a feminist issue. It's a global epidemic that is going to take all of us with concerted effort to change direction on. And yet, in my 40 years of working in this field, it continues to be women showing up to try to figure out how to make changes. So let's be mighty, but we are too small to do it on our own. But let's start the conversation here. So today this is actually a list of what we are and aren't going to, oh no, you took it off. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we call misperceptions, or the dominant discourses around woman abuse, because that's the place that we need to start, is getting clear about what's true and not true in the lives of women. I'm going to introduce you to a model to support women impacted by abuse. And there's 3 particular tools that we use, or exercises, that really help women to be able to re-narrate their story using their own words and through a lens that's more helpful for them. And then I want to talk a little bit about implications for coaches and workplace implications, and just point you in a couple of directions for resources following that. So that's today. Okay. So just a reminder, this is connected to International Women's Day. Imagine a gender equal world, a world free of bias, stereotypes, and discrimination, a world that's diverse, equitable, and inclusive, a world where difference is valued and celebrated. Together, we can forge women's equality, and I would add equity. And that's a reminder that when we're talking about men's violence or gender-based violence against women, that we're not talking about it to make people uncomfortable or to call out. We're talking about a bigger vision of what does it look like when we let go of bias, let go of stereotypes, and actually operate at a human level with each other. And we're not there yet, but I love this way of thinking about International Women's Day, that it's aspirational, and anything that's uncovered is in service of reducing barriers and increasing equity and equality. So it is 2 in 10 women. And those rates vary.
Oh,
we know.
No, Jill. It's
yeah,
more than 4%.
Sorry, I'm reading the numbers.
44%. Yes. Yeah.
Every 2 days, a woman is killed by her partner. Every 6 days, a woman is killed by her partner in Canada. 40% of women report that abuse made it difficult to work. And again, whenever we look at these stats, just a reminder that we know it's underreported. Very often women don't identify with what's happening to them as abuse because the ideas around abuse are very distorted in the public discourse. So this is for women who've identified that they are experiencing abuse, or some of the stats reflect some of what's happening, but very often not all of what's happening. And I think it's only 25% of people know a woman who's experienced abuse, which is very low considering the number of women who've actually experienced abuse. So thank you for that, everyone. So there's at least 6 reasons why we should be knowledgeable. First of all, abuse can happen to anyone. It can happen to us. It can happen to our sisters, our mothers, our friends, our coworkers. So we all need to feel equipped to address it and so be support. A violence-informed approach creates safety for women so that they can identify a support person and speak about it. As support people, we need to know so that we don't recreate the patterns of abuse or take control over the situation and compound the situation for women. Very often conventional responses can make it worse for women. So we're trying to help people move to the right paradigm in order to support women. And men's coercive control is everyone's responsibility. It is not just the responsibility of women, or not just the responsibility of women who have been targeted by an abusive partner. And finally, women and children's future depends on our response, which means globally, we all depend on getting this right. Okay, so let's talk about these dominant discourses or misperceptions. They are widely held beliefs that control the narrative. So they win out over women's voices, and women's voices who are the experts of their experience. And they are taken up and supported through the patriarchal discourses that are found in all of our institutional institutions, our financial institutions, our legal institutions, our public schools, etc., all kind of are supported within that dominant narrative. So women are influenced, women who've experienced abuse are influenced by the dominant discourses. So when we meet women, they will often rely on the dominant discourse to explain what's happening to them. So they will tell us they're responsible. They'll tell us it wasn't that bad because there was no physical abuse. They'll tell us that she was responsible because she was, raised in an abusive family, or that she did things that brought on the responsibility. And what's happening there is that women are relying on the dominant discourse to explain what they're experiencing, rather than using what they know to be true. These dominant discourses are very often echoed by service providers, leading to what we often now refer to as the harms of help, where help is designed based on these misperceptions and therefore are not a relevant support to women. And so women often get re-victimized in services, including sometimes women's services. And the dominant discourse leads to policies and practices that don't address women's needs. So we're spending billions of dollars every year between health and legal and services to support women who've experienced abuse, and to to cope with men's abuse, like police interventions, etc. And they're very often not the right solution. So we're putting a lot of money into services that have no proven efficacy. Just kind of depressing. So physical abuse is the most serious form of abuse, is the first dominant discourse. How does that show up in practice? Like in our lives, that this is a dominant discourse. And I think somebody already said it. I think Carlene said it wasn't ever physical abuse, right? Like that's the real meaning of, that's the most significant impact of abuse or type of abuse. But what women say is that a lot of it was just verbal, but I wish he would have hit me instead of what he said. The words hurt more than any beating could have, and they did more damage for the long term, but no one took that seriously. And so I'll introduce you to the power and control cycle later, but it's about putting all the different types of abuse into a wheel, and to remind all of us, but women in particular, that there is no one kind of abuse that is more hurtful, harmful, or leaves more long-term effects than another. And that in combination is really the cumulative effect that is so powerful and seriously harmful for women. But it is definitely a major and dominant discourse. So it means in legal proceedings, if she hasn't experienced physical abuse, she's not taken seriously. In terms of protecting children, she's not taken seriously. Police don't intervene if there's not signs of physical abuse. Hospitals that have screening programs are only screening really for physical assault. But in women's lives, they do not think that is, and in my experience, that is not the most harmful aspect of abuse. When I was at BC Women's Hospital, we conducted research over about a 5-year period. We were looking particularly at the link between violence against women and women's experiences of substance use and mental health. And so these are the quotes. We've held focus groups with about 200 women across the province in 18 communities. And so these are the quotes from them. Thanks, Dave. Another dominant discourse is that it takes two to tango. In other words, both, like, it's mutual, and so both people are responsible for the problem. But in reality, wherever there's power, it is not both people's responsibility, whether it's bullying, racism, gender-based violence. Where there's a power imbalance, the person with the power controls both the narrative and the actions and the solutions. So women don't have access to solutions because the partner is not willing to make a difference. But the language of mutual battering has emerged over the last 15 years as a way of describing a he said, she said situation where nobody's interested in putting this other larger paradigm of power over top of what they're just viewing. So when a police officer arrives at the door, and very often she's in much worse condition emotionally, and he's very pulled together, the sympathy goes with him, and she looks like she's having mental health problems or out of control. But this idea of mutual battering is that both are responsible, and it fits or conforms to the idea of it takes two to tango, basically, that we're all in relationships, we all have a responsibility. And it's simply not true where there's abuse. Women are not responsible for the abuse. No matter what any of us does, we're not responsible for harms that arise from that. And so what we do know is that in reality, about 88 to 95% of victims of abuse are women. And yet this belief that we're both responsible continues to persist. Why it isn't mutual? Well, there are lots of research on this, but one is that women rarely initiate violence against men. Women's violence is frequently retaliatory or in self-defense, and that's the context that isn't very often seen when people step into the lives where there's abuse. And the impacts are far-reaching and more severe for women. So when I was running a men's treatment program, women's support program, when we did the intake with men who were abusive, they all told us about the ways in which she was abusive as well. So they would say things like, you know, she broke my finger, she slammed a door in my finger and broke it. And when you put the context around it, he had trapped her in a bathroom for 4 hours, and she finally tried to escape, and in doing so slammed the door, and he went to hospital and very willingly told the healthcare worker that she'd done that to him. And so if we didn't have a context around it or an understanding of this bigger picture, in that moment, that's what it looks like. She's the one who's the abuser or the attacker. We also know that men use much more extreme forms of abuse. It only happens to certain women, and the certain women has meant that many women don't know how to say what's happening to them because they don't belong to a vulnerable group of women. So we have these unconscious biases that allow us to say things like, these women keep making bad choices. I can see why she can't stay with a man. It's a cultural thing, either race, socioeconomic, class, etc. Well, you can't blame him, or she's an addict, or she has mental health issues, as if those explain why he's targeted her for abuse. But the reality is that there is no gender sees no class, no race. It occurs in every walk of life. Young women are particularly vulnerable to abuse, and they're the demographic that are most likely to be murdered by a partner. But those are a few of the outstanding things. What's more true is that women who are more vulnerable, who are experiencing abuse, have less access to resources. And that part is what's the differentiator. They face more barriers to get support and services. So abuse happens to women who have low self-esteem. That's a very often an explanation. Okay. Yeah, so what's more true than this statement? What's actually more accurate? Let's do a quick reframe on that. Yeah,
I would just say abuse happens to women regardless of their self-esteem.
Right. And what women will sometimes say is that they were okay before, and that it's actually the abuse that impacts their sense of themselves or their value or esteem. Yeah. So it's actually, so we have it reversed. Not that that should make any difference. I think that's the other point you're making, is that low self-esteem is not a reason to target women for abuse. So this woman says, I was always judged for letting the abuse happen to me because of my low self-esteem and lack of confidence. I wasn't like that before I met my partner. If you go to the self-help books, I mean, it's really just a litany of perpetuations of the dominant discourses. But there are lots of books targeted towards women with low self-esteem in many forms. Sorry, Carlene, I want to see what you're saying. Yeah, I think abuse impacts both self-esteem and equality, equally, as you've said. It lowers the esteem of others towards them. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. You know, the demeanor of a woman who's experienced abuse is often the next way that women get targeted. Well, she's not standing up for herself, or if she would only, right? That idea. So totally, you know, people lose respect for her. Yeah, thank you for that comment. Abused women make bad choices, and some of you from the lab will recognize this quote, but it's such a powerful one. And the way that this shows up in practice is that we hear women making choices, and without the context or backdrop of abuse, we think that does not make any sense to us, right? Like a woman that I'm supporting was telling me that her partner, she once again gave her partner the money for their rent, which because he asked for it, and he spent it on gambling. And she said to herself, I'm so stupid. And then she told the group, I'm so stupid. Like I knew that he wasn't going to use it for the rent. And so then when we asked what was the context around that, well, it was threatening. He took the keys from her, he took her cell phone from her. So there's no stupidity there, but that's how the dominant discourse shows up for women is I'm so stupid and I made a bad choice. But in reality, here's what choice looks like. My hip was broken. My partner had broken my hip. So do you see how she starts in this very neutral language because she's learned to not blame her partner. Otherwise people are like, whoa, that's not cool. Like, how do you know it was his fault? Or what did you do to deserve it? So my hip was broken. My partner had broken my hip and I chose not to go to the hospital until I was out of the situation. But then she says he refused to take me. So she didn't really choose, he refused. He stopped me from going. People say that you make your own choices, that you can do whatever you want. To an extent, I agree, but when you make that choice, you and your children could be killed. So you choose not to. That choice is made for you. And that's the silent narrative that's happening around her, the one that we all need to start acknowledging and thinking about. And so when we put on this kind of safety lens first, things look different through that lens than through the lens of autonomy or independence or self-sufficiency and agency. Next dominant discourse is why does she stay? We ask that all the time. If it's so bad, she would leave. Sometimes sort of thrown in there or worked in there is the idea that she was attracted to him in the first place. So there's lots of ideas about why she gets into the relationship and why she stays in the relationship. And I'll introduce you to one of the tools that helps women to understand that. But we know women are 6 times more likely to be killed by an ex-partner after they leave, like rather than being currently in. So leaving is dangerous. So it's not just a myth. 50% of women murdered were killed within 2 months. So of leaving the relationship. So that period of time is really important for women to be able to access safety. Currently in Canada, thousands of women every night are waiting to get into a transition house. I just talked to somebody the other day and said, yeah, they're doing well. They're on the wait list for a transition house. So it's no longer for crises for women. It's about planning a departure. So we have, again, fewer and fewer resources for women. 60% of dating violence happens after the relationship has ended. And not that it wasn't there before, but there's more escalation and therefore more risk involved. And the idea of women just need to leave really oversimplifies additional risks beyond her partner's abuse, which is economic realities these days are so such a barrier for women. Housing shortages and just like horrendous housing that's available, unsafe and unclean, and in parts of town that feel very risky to women. Legal fees, the legal system, there's no such thing as legal aid basically any longer. Women don't have access to justice. Poverty, we know that men's standard of living goes up when in divorce and women's goes down in where there's no abuse. And so we know that that increases because of men's control, and financial abuse is one of the ongoing means that they have to control women after they've left the relationship. And this fear that they're going to have to share their custody with their abusive ex-partner, because the 50-50 custody is now the default in the court system. So there are lots of reasons that women don't just leave. So what I mean and what we mean in the field by gender-based abuse is really, I don't love the term gender-based abuse. I really think it's more accurate to talk about woman abuse because that's the predominant problem, that it's not a single incident. So occasionally we'll hear people talking about that was abuse, and what they really mean is that was bad behavior, maybe even terrible behavior, but not abuse. Because it has to be a pattern, and it has to be a unilateral pattern, one person controlling the pattern of the abuse. And that person is 100% responsible for the abuse. There's no negotiation. In the men's treatment program, we used to think like, feel like we were constantly negotiating, like, okay, I'll take 60% of the responsibility. Like, we probably start at 0. So, if we get to 60, it was something. But men are very reluctant, and they're used to having power, so they're used to having a say over it, and so they don't want to take responsibility for it. The intention is about oppressing women, frightening women, humiliating and demeaning women. It's not about physically harming women. Physical abuse is really only often used when other means of control aren't working. And a particular kind of person who has a rage that is where he's let himself step over lots of those lines of control. It includes a broad range of coercive, oppressive, and control tactics. So in the literature, more now we're hearing the language of coercive control rather than abuse to represent this dynamic. And the trick here, and it's so vital to understand this, that part of the abuse is this interspersed with positive looking behavior. So if it was all negative, if he brought out, a gun on the first date or threatened to kill her mom on the second date, she wouldn't be staying with him. But the first part of the relationship is almost always and primarily this positive looking behavior, and telling us, among other things, that he has full control over what he's doing and works with lots of intention. But also, if we don't understand that form of abuse that is this positive looking behavior, we can't understand why women are attracted or stay in the relationship. So it's really important that we hold that piece as part of our understanding. Also, we measure the abuse more by the impacts and not by the intentions or the acts. So we used to, in the old days of collecting data, we would ask women how he was abusive. And now we don't, because it's really more a measure of what the impact is that tells us really what's significant for women. So the 3 models that I'm going to talk about are part of the group support model that I developed in conjunction with a colleague, Karen McCandless Davis, and we have a book that's been selling for nearly 20 years, continues to be relevant. We're kind of in 3rd edition now, so we've added some things like cell phone instead of go to the phone or carry a dime. Right? Just kidding, but yeah. So we've updated some of it, but unfortunately, most of it's very relevant today in the same ways that it has been over the last 20 or 30 years. So let's look at 3 of them. The first one is the cycle of abuse, and likely you've all seen this in some form. And again, why it's important is that it shows the honeymoon, which is how women first meet their partners. Their partners are attractive, they share things in common, they might work together, they love hiking or skiing, or she has a child and he's really loving towards the child and wants to have more children and paints a picture of their future that's very romantic and beautiful. And so it aligns with a lot of her values or vision of her life. So there's no warning signs, like literally no warning signs. And so she's on this, what I think of as this line between, is it control or is it care? And we don't even teach women to go in wondering about that line, but we need to. And then the first time something happens, like in all of our relationships, the first time something happens where there's some conflict, we don't leave. So the first time might be something very minor, like insulting her in public, or making a sarcastic comment, or showing up late for a date and he'd been drinking, or she found out he lied about something. So they're not inconsequential, but they're not enough to say, I'm leaving. And then when she confronts him on it, he may slam a door, disappear for a few days, not respond to texts, do something that's a warning, but not, again, with the backdrop of these weeks or months or year of honeymoon, it would not make sense to make a decision to leave with a couple of those incidents. But as the cycle continues, it's the honeymoon that keeps trapping women, because the promises to change, the apologies, the return to who she thinks she fell in love with is all the compelling and trapping part of the relationship. But the other part tends to escalate and get more severe. And with that, layers on lots of impacts or effects for women. So they get less well, they get less confident in themselves, they lose friendships, they lose their job potentially. And so they become more and more vulnerable and dependent. And so leaving becomes a more difficult proposition for them as time goes on, because they're exhausted and overwhelmed. Now they've got children. So lots happens in that cycle. But I think the main thing that women really find helpful is that they no longer feel like they've got a, you know, what women say, I've got a V on my forehead, like I'm some kind of target. That they see that they made really good choices, and that he was the one who made choices to misuse his responsibilities in the relationship and put her and the kids at risk. So that's a really brief overview. We do it again from the women's perspective, because we're trying to understand also how she experiences it. And sometimes it's the first time anybody's asked her that question, because we're very focused on what he's doing, but way less focused on how she's experienced. Like, how do you experience the honeymoon? You know, at first it was such a relief. Now it's just a time that I think maybe I can get the kids a new pair of shoes or call my mom without repercussions. So it's really important wherever we can to give women a voice. And, you know, Karen and I both have said this, like, we draw that cycle on napkins with a woman, or I'm doing an EQ debrief and I realize that there's more going on here, and I shift gears, or in a coaching session. And it's a really powerful tool to help shift the narrative for women and give her some words to describe what's happening to her. So this woman says, I was in a very abusive, violent relationship for too long. I was so worn down because his moods would change just like that. And these are the kinds of words that you're looking for, right? She won't say, like, we moved between the honeymoon and the tension and the escalation. She'll say, like, he's so moody, or he was unpredictable, or this thing, one minute he'd tell me how much he loves me, and the next minute he'd be hitting me or screaming at me, and I never knew. And so this helps to give women a frame for understanding this. But also, you know, as coaches or in HR, whatever your workplace is, start listening for these codes that women have for telling you about what's happening. And I know for me, because I've been doing the work a long time, I'm able to say to women, here's my work. And if you ever, you know, if that's, I don't know if this is relevant for you, but, you know, just offer this to you. So there's ways to do it without, you know, making it unsafe for women. So the honeymoon is great. I mean, the cycle is great because it helps to shift the ideas that women are attracted to abuse, rather than the reality, which is women are attracted to the honeymoon behavior. The other idea that's dominant in our culture is that women believe abuse is normal. And so when I ask women, so what did you hope out of the relationship? Like what we all hope: friendship, intimacy, a future together, loving and caring for children. Like, they don't have a different set of values, even when they've experienced or witnessed abuse as a child. They don't come in thinking they're going to be abused. They come in, they meet this guy who's in honeymoon, and it is what they are looking for in a relationship. And finally, the dominant discourse that women have low expectations and accept it. That is just simply not true. Women resist in all kinds of ways, and they're always fighting for equality and respect. If you ask women what they've tried to do, they've read every self-help book, they've gone to counselors, they've gone to their pastor, they've talked to family members. Like, they are asking for help. And we just keep giving them the dominant discourse back, so they don't get the help they need. Power and control, which I referenced earlier, is very important, because the cycle looks at it in terms of the pattern, which is not a tidy pattern, by the way. It's not like women can predict the pattern, or that it's not meant to be used as a predictive tool. It just helps women see that abusive men have 3 channels that they can kind of turn to, depending on whether they're in a honeymoon or tension or explosion. And again, these are not words that are true. They're not really honeymoon. It's entrapment. Tension is really about creating fear, and the explosion is really an escalation of the abuse that he's been using throughout the cycle. So the power and control wheel now is telling us this idea that we looked at earlier, that all forms of abuse have an impact. And what helps women here is that they can name these small things that don't seem like they should be important, but it's the cumulative effect of all of these small acts that she dismissed, or he dismissed on her behalf, or others dismissed, that now begin to make sense as part of the whole pattern of abuse. I realize it's hard to see this, but intellectual abuse using culture. So for example, his culture is always superior, and even if they share a culture, his interpretation of culture gives him control and power and entitlements that aren't necessarily the culture, but that he uses it in that way. Similarly with spiritual abuse, that his faith is superior, that he may alienate the church community from her by telling things about her that aren't true as a way for her to lose the support that she had, or just like not allowing her to practice her faith. Some things we understand more of, but using pets and property, so very targeted abuse of things that really matter deeply to her. Similarly with the children, threatening to kill children if she leaves, or kill family members if she leaves. A friend of mine was a lawyer, and she was working with a woman who finally had court resolved, and the mother of this young woman said, I can't believe this took so long for her to leave. And my friend said, she didn't leave because he threatened to kill you, your husband, and the children. And so there's this, always remember that if it's not making sense, we just don't know enough of the story yet. And that's why we're carrying this idea of safety with us all the time, so that we can fill in the blanks for ourselves. Thanks, Dave. So women, again, you can get mentally abused, or you can get physically abused, you can get the shit beaten out of you, but you can be manipulated and put down, and you can be financially abused. There's lots of different kinds of abuse, and they all kill your spirit. The physical abuse was not as bad because the bruises go away, but the mental and verbal abuse has really stuck with me for a long time. And not to underestimate the impact of physical abuse, it can be long lasting and horrific for women as well. So I'm aware that some women have experienced really horrendous physical abuse, and I don't want to underestimate the impact of that either. So the power and control wheel really helps to shift away from the idea that abusive men are out of control and that it's limited to physical abuse. But now that we see this as about maintaining power and control, and that abusive men view the relationship from that perspective of control. And that there's lots of different tactics to maintain that control. And the third tool is this idea of moving from what he's done to how it's impacted her. And so this is just a short list. Women usually fill up 7 or 8 flip charts full of the impacts of abuse. And between the power and control wheel and this exercise, it usually takes us 3 weeks to cover these two, because women finally have so much to say. And if you're getting the sense of it, what we do is we offer women these blank templates that they can begin to use their words and their experiences to fill in. And that's what's so empowering about it, is that we don't tell them any of this list. This is their list, but we give them the frameworks. And that's the way that they can start to lay down their story in a different way, so they can tell it in a way that's true for them, not in a way that's true so they can get into services or get some financial aid or keep their jobs, but in a way that's really accurate. And because we do it in a group setting, it helps all of them feel like they're not the ones that are crazy or responsible. They can see it in other women first very often. And so doing one-to-one work without this backdrop can sometimes keep women kind of away from their own knowledge. But with other women, they get to have a closer connection to what's really happened to them. So you can see this long, very long list that's both mental health issues, physical health issues, and then bigger life pictures, like, you know, living in poverty and not being able to see their kids and not being able to protect their kids. So I want to talk a little bit about the coaching response to women abuse, and what some of the things we might hear from women. Like, and I'm going to check in with you around this as well, but we might hear that they have low confidence or low self-esteem, or that they don't feel like they're ever enough. That might be one theme that we hear. How would we reframe that possibly? What's another kind of explanation for that? Rather than working directly on building up her self-esteem, for example, or building her confidence, what might we check? What's a question we could ask? So you might just ask where she's getting her information from, right? Like who's her biggest fan? What do they tell her about herself? when was there a time that she did have confidence in how she was? She might say it was before her marriage. So again, thinking of that quote that we heard, that women come into relationships not with low self-esteem, but the impact is there. And so I never just assume that my job is going to be work on and helping her build up her self-esteem. Codependence, it might sound something like, I have to check with my partner, or my partner wanted to do this, or my partner is going away. And so like you'll hear this reference to partner a lot, and it would be easy. I think codependence is not a helpful idea in general, but it would be very easy to think of that looked like codependence rather than a safety. Right? Women's job is safety and reducing risk. And the way she does that is to make sure she checks in with her partner around everything. And so it doesn't look like she's independent. So as a coach, we might think we want to work on her independence a little bit more here. We're using the word trauma a lot these days, and to some extent collapsing the concept of trauma with abuse. So what a woman might say to me is, I experienced trauma as a child, or I experienced trauma from a previous relationship. And I think I know that what she's talking about is that she was with an abusive partner. I don't correct her, but I find that trauma is such a generalized and honestly overused idea that means everything from car accidents to military involvement to genocide to sexual violence to violence in a relationship, that it doesn't have a lot of meaning. But it does alert me to the fact that that's what she's trying to tell me, is that the abuse has had an effect on her. Andrea.
This discussion, it reminds me of what you've shown us in the coaching lab around our stance and our posture when we go into a debrief. So, because it's very tempting to design a narrative already based on the perception of self and what you've been through, which may not be anything about what your client has been through at all.
Right. Yeah.
So it's when we're seeing whether it's self-regard, when we're seeing independence, when we're seeing what you just said to me resonates in that it's not about moving the range. It's about acknowledging how the range is serving today, because from what you've said, it serves you in a lot of ways for safety. That it's there, but it's not there to pick apart. It's there to acknowledge it and how it's serving you and what it's doing and what's behind that range.
Yeah. And to that, I would also add, she may not even control the range, right? So that's the other piece to it, is that it's limited by external sources, which is true for lots of us for lots of different reasons, but it's very limited. And she does not, expansion or retraction is just not a possibility. So we need to see it through that lens of, it's a coping strategy or a safety strategy, not a choice.
Like the agency, the agency comes to mind. And you've showed us that there are when you have no options, there's no choice.
Yeah, when the option is limited to staying alive or having your kids killed. In my coaching course, we talked a lot about working with people who are stuck and hopeless, and I always was translating for myself the meaning of what stuck is. And sometimes we're just stuck, but sometimes women are actually trapped. And so that's for us to figure out, are they trapped, or are they just struggling with something that they need to get unstuck from? So again, I'm just trying to raise some of the coaching things that we might hear that are code for something different. Andrea, thanks. You already talked about choice, right? That we can't treat, in general, it's naive to think that we all have all choices in front of us. We're limited all the time. But what are choices for women is much narrower.
Yeah, and Jill, you frequently say that abusers take all good choices off the table, so there's no good choices left.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, and that is a powerful idea for women when they've been really berating themselves for making bad choices, that abusive men take all the good choices off. So they're left with one or two crappy options, and no wonder it's hard for them to decide. So they might seem indecisive, and that's another thing that you might hear in a coaching practice. We tend, whether we mean to or not, as client-centered work people, to focus on what's wrong with her rather than what's happened to her. And I think that shift is a powerful one, moving from what's wrong to what's happened. And the narrative changes a lot when you work in that space. Also thinking about women as victims. I think it was Carlene that changed it to survivor. I'm sorry, someone else did that. But that's so true, right? Women are surviving, for many of us, unthinkable circumstances. And we need to remember that they are not victims. They are targets for sure, but they're not victims. And they're women that we work with, women that come on these calls, women that are leading us in organizations. These are not women. When I worked at BC Women's Hospital, 33% of nurses said that they were currently in or had been in an abusive relationship. So these are women that are us. Boundaries, I've got a little diagram there that we use in our groups. Women who experience abuse are not setting boundaries, and they're not setting boundaries not because they can't, but because it's not safe. There's no role for assertiveness here for women. If she sets a boundary which says this is not okay, an abuser will just charge right through it, or they'll manipulate their way into it, or they'll kind of worm their way around it, or they'll just leap over the boundary or tunnel underneath it. So there's no boundaries is never the problem where there's abuse. And so when I hear women say I don't have very good boundaries, I become very curious and suspicious about whether that's true or not. Because in safe relationships, we actually don't really need boundaries, right? Because there's an agreed upon respect. So where boundaries kind of show up for us, or the need for boundaries, is when somebody's not respecting it. And that signals something about a power dynamic to me. But we always make the boundary setter responsible and not the boundary breaker responsible. We might use words like containment, which I think is, the idea from trauma side of the work is that we should not allow women to talk too much about their story because it might be evoking for them. My stance is that we become the container for women. It's important that we tell her she's not too much for us, and that we can hold her story and be okay with it. You might hear emotional dysregulation. You can imagine that I don't love that language. Because really what's happening is that women are responding to the cycle. If you think about the emotional state for women in the honeymoon versus the tension versus the explosion, what's different for her is really, again, a reaction to what's happening to her and how she's being pushed around or driven around the cycle. And those are not experiences that are in her control. And it's not about emotional dysregulation. It's an appropriate human response to what's happening to her. So our job is to create the safe space. We bring compassion. We bring the opportunity for women to talk about what's happened to them. That means we need to show them with material, with recognizing 1 in 3 women, like whatever we want to use to tell women that we understand that that might be part of their experience and it belongs in the coaching session. It's not a separate thing. And normalizing and affirming. And nobody can do that better than other women in a group together. But our job is to say, yeah, like I just did this course, or I just saw this cycle. I don't know if it's relevant for you. Let me draw it out and see if there's anything in it. So this idea about stopping the story is when we don't create safe space. It's like, that's too much for me. And that's what we don't want women to hear from us. So if we stop women from sharing their experience, we're saying to her that I can't hold her story, and that she is too much. And that echoes the dynamics of the abuse. Workplace response. Similarly, some of the things you might see in a workplace and observe about the abusive partner. And this is like, of course, we're working all the time with men who are abusive too, right? If there's 1 in 3 women, there's also 1 in 3 men. And so those are also our colleagues and our leaders and our staff and our coaches. But in a workplace where there's a woman in your space who's experiencing abuse, you might see the stalking behavior. So he waits for her outside of work. He frequently calls or texts during the week. If he's distracting for her, she always takes the text calls. She steps out of the room to take a call. And there might be some irritation with that. right? It's like she's at work, like she doesn't have any boundaries around when she answers the phone or responds to text, or she's always got that phone close by. The honeymoon behavior, you might see flowers at work. Dave and I often joke about that. He's a couple of times sent flowers to work. Like, well, because the thing for abusive men is that they want these public displays so that they honeymoon other people, not just her, right? So that's him honeymooning everybody to show everybody what a great guy he is and how thoughtful he is. And he's picking her up after work. And that's all the grooming that he does to make sure that she loses her allies or supports, and is confused and manipulated like everyone else. Other gifts, but they're all sent to the workplace. So they're intentionally designed to make sure he controls the narrative on him. And what we might observe about a woman, which I've kind of said already, but extended time away from work, women who experience abuse have more health issues, but they also have other reasons for needing to stay away, court appearances, just, after a bad night of being kept awake all night, etc. So they may be like just appear sad or withdrawn or more nervous about things, make excuses for their partner, possibly covering injuries and just not being able to concentrate. So a picture of someone who you might think, is she depressed? Is she what's she going through? But we don't very often think, is she in an abusive relationship? Because the stereotype of the woman who's abused is a woman who's low income, uneducated, right, racialized. That's part of what the stereotype does, is keep us away from knowing that there are always women in any circle that we're in who have experienced abuse from a partner. So supporting women at work, some of the things that you can do, make sure that there's information related to women abuse available in the open, like the cycle, like the power and control wheel, something that says to women, we know that this is happening for women, that you're available to make safety and support planning. So women have always got their own safety plan. They may not call it that, but they've always got, money somewhere tucked away. They've got their kids' belongings somewhere else. They've got their own clothes packed away. They've got documents. Like, women have not necessarily thoroughly developed a plan for escaping, but they've done some things. So if you're going to do a safety plan, start with whether they've already done and name it that, a safety plan. Because sometimes women feel guilty about it, like that they're hiding money from their partner or whatever. So name it safety. Story I often tell when I was at BC Women's, I was supporting a woman whose partner was part of a gang. And so he had gang members at the entrance door where she came and went every day. And so I very cleverly said, well, we got to make sure that you're entering and exiting from different doors around BC Women's and Children's. And she was like, are you kidding? Like, I need to keep the same routine, in the same door, out the same door, at the same time, all the time. Otherwise, he knows that I know. So always trust that women are the experts. They may not have all the resources available to them to execute, but they know more than we'll ever know about their circumstances. And so be a help, and add in, but we're not leading the process. So be clear about confidentiality. So it's not about, like in the men's program, they waived their confidentiality because anything that got said in the group could be shared with his partner. But on the women's side, it was complete confidentiality. Nothing ever got said. So we can hold different standards because one is a perpetrator and one is a survivor. So it's important to be clear about what we can and can't keep confidential, and make sure that so that women can tell us what they feel is safe to tell, that we won't have to act on. Make sure you hold the abuser accountable. So don't ask women to fix or work on the problem, right? Have you seen a couples counselor? Like Dave and I often get that around grief. Like if I'm still crying or sad, people are like, are you seeing a counselor? like that's somehow going to take the grief away. So make sure that we're not asking women to work on something that isn't theirs to work on. Challenge the dominant discourse. So you might hear in the office somebody saying something pejorative about a woman, and challenge that discourse. Like, we don't know what's happening in her life. Be aware of how power dynamics at work can be triggers. I don't like the word triggers. I'm not sure how that got in there, but that kind of command and control. So leaders that use bullying tactics or yell at workers. I was trying to person the other day whose boss like literally yells for hours at a time at their staff. So imagine that at work and then that at home. And then be careful not to confuse impacts with deficits, right? So forgetful, lack of concentration, some of those things, often sick, we can see those as defects in a woman rather than the impacts of abuse. And then make sure that you offer in-house training so that everybody holds this perspective. And there's a few resources for you.
Jill, thank you so much, because even something you said earlier to me resonated in terms of not promising safety, even in coaching, that we might want to, but we don't know what safe is to the other person. So to guarantee safety, it might be out of our purview. It's just so much that we assume, I guess is what I'm saying. We assume so much through lack of evidence and lack of just asking.
Absolutely. And to that extent, I think we got to change our language of like how we use safe, right? Because I work with a population of women who truly doesn't feel safe, when we use it in different ways, like, we're trying to create a safe space, I'm not sure what the word is instead, but it's like we're not unsafe. So it kind of diminishes women's experiences of abuse or people's experiences of abuse and racism and oppression when we overuse the language of safety. So yeah, you're right. We cannot guarantee it. We can try in our space, and we can have it open enough to say, I'm aware that there's things that I'm not going to know that, and if I'm off at all, it's our job together to make sure that we stay on what's important to you and what reflects your experience. Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Thanks very much, everyone. Send comments. We're wondering whether we want to build a course for coaches around this. So any thoughts that you have, let me know. Love to hear from you. Bye.